Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are held every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us. We have an upcoming event on August 6th that you can find more information on this slide or also on our website. We now offer advertising, so contact me for more information. And our webinar today is sponsored by AccuTrack, and here's a short message from them.
AccuTrack Consulting and Accounting Services is an 8A WOSB CPA firm committed to supporting entities to sustain growth in government contracting. Our outstanding DCAA accounting solutions reduce audit risk, improve cash flows, and give you peace of mind. Contact us today to learn how we can enhance your DCAA accounting efforts.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Maria Panichelli, and we're going to be covering partnering in GovCon, best practices for JVs and mentor-protege relationships. Maria, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mallory, and thanks everyone for joining us. Today, in this second part of our two-part webinar on partnering in GovCon, I'm going to be talking about best practices for joint ventures and for mentor-protege relationships. Next slide, please. So for those of you who didn't join on the first part of the webinar, just a quick rundown about me. My name is Maria Panichelli. I am a partner and the chair of the Government Contracting Practice Group at Obermeyer, Redmond, Maxwell, and Hippel. I focus my practice exclusively on government contracting, and that includes many different items, but what we're going to be talking about today is focused on small business procurement. And I do a lot of that as part of my practice, and a lot of that involves specifically teaming, joint ventures, and mentor-protege process. So we talked about teaming in the first part of this webinar series, and now we're going to talk about successful JVs and mentor-protege pairs. By way of kind of agenda or overview, I've listed on this first slide kind of the things that I see as an experienced government contracting attorney that lead to successful joint ventures and to successful mentor-protege relationship pairs. And we're going to talk about each one of these things kind of as we go, but it's important to just kind of give an overview, I think, so everyone has an idea of where we're coming from. So I think first point is you've got to make sure that you know the difference. If you're going to form a successful joint venture or a mentor-protege pair, want to know how to differentiate between teaming and joint ventures. You're also going to want to understand when and why the mentor-protege programs get explained or discussed in the context of teaming and joint venture, and when the mentor-protege program comes into play. You're going to want to understand that the mentor-protege program is really only step one. We're going to talk about what that means as we go forward. And here's one that a lot of people forget, and they forget that they should do this up front. But you're going to want to ensure ahead of time. And I mean, before you go through, a long, lengthy negotiation process trying to get your joint venture set up, or the application process for the mentor-protege process, for the mentor-protege program, rather, you're going to want to talk to your partner, your potential JV, your potential mentor, your potential protege, and make sure that both partners are aware of and willing to fulfill all of the obligations that they have. The regulations put a host of obligations on both the mentor and the protege, and on the joint venture partners. There are very specific provisions that need to be put into joint venture agreements. And I've seen, unfortunately, a lot of potential partnerships come to me late in the process and say, hey, we've done X, Y, and Z, and now we want to take the next step. And at that point, they realize that something that has to be in their joint venture agreement, or something that the SBA is going to require in order for the mentor-protege pair to stay active, they're just not willing to do. And because they didn't know about those obligations ahead of time, they wasted all of their time going through steps X, Y, and Z and getting to, the next step before realizing that it really wasn't something that was going to work for them. So ahead of time, make sure that you consult, a consultant or a legal expert, someone who's familiar with the requirements of the joint venture regs and the mentor-protege regulations, so that both partners are aware of what their obligations are, and that both partners have a conversation about their willingness to fulfill those obligations throughout the entire relationship. Otherwise, this can be a huge waste of time. Also, you're going to want to make sure that both partners are clear on the SBA's view of the mentor-protege programs, and we're going to talk about what I mean by that as we go forward. And finally, as I said, there are a lot of regulations governing this area. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with the regulations, know where your obligations are listed, talk to someone who can help you guide you through the process about understanding those regulations and your obligations, and understanding when you have to do what to make sure that you are not getting yourself in trouble in terms of compliance as you move forward. Next slide, please. So the first thing, and this is going to be a recap for those of you who just attended the first part of this webinar, but the first thing is you need to understand the difference between teaming and joint venturing. Teaming is basically a special type of subcontracting. You still have a prime, you still have a sub. Usually in the small business context, you've got a prime that's a small business and a sub that's a large business. You've got the small business prime leveraging the capabilities of the large business sub. You've got the large business sub teaming up with the prime so that they have access to some set-aside small contract dollars. Joint ventures, you've got a whole new entity, or at least most of the time, and I think it's advisable, you form a whole new entity. You've got several companies that are coming together, and they each own a share of the joint venture. The joint venture is then the prime contractor that's going after specific contracts with the federal government. Mentor-protege comes into the mix because the mentor-protege program is one avenue by which, or is the avenue, I should say, by which a large company and a small company can form a joint venture and still be small. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but that's why you'll hear mentor-protege discussed kind of in the same mix, or oftentimes in the same presentations as teaming and joint venturing. That being said, it's important to understand, and we're going to talk about this as we go forward, but it's important to understand that from the SBA's point of view, the mentor-protege programs were developed in order to help businesses grow. They want small businesses learning, growing, expanding, becoming more profitable, becoming better companies. That, in the SBA's eyes, is the purpose of the SBA mentor-protege programs, to mentor a small business. Yes, one of the benefits is that you can form certain types of joint ventures, but the SBA does not look kindly upon mentor-protege pairs that are only formed because of the desire to do joint ventures, and are then therefore a little bit lax in fulfilling those other obligations that I alluded to earlier. So one of the things I want to stress early, and you're going to hear me say throughout this presentation, is that you're always going to want to keep in mind the SBA's view with regard to the mentor-protege programs. Next slide, please. So you've decided to form a joint venture rather than team. And we talked about in my first presentation today why that might be. Certain things that you want to assess, like the level of control or timing, or whether you're going after a specific procurement. Those are the things that you're going to want to talk about with your partner that will lead you to be able to decide, should I team or should I joint venture? But for purposes of this second part of my presentation, we're assuming you've decided joint venturing is the way to go. So the first question you're always going to want to start with is, who is forming the joint venture? Because if you're talking about a joint venture that wants to go after small business set-aside contracts, or specific types of small business set-asides like SDVOSB set-asides, WSB set-asides, etc., you're going to want to make sure that you form the JV in such a way that the JV is considered a quote-unquote small business, right? Or considered an SDVOSB business, etc. In order to do that, the fundamental question is, who is forming the JV? And the reason for that is based on affiliation rules. Affiliation is a concept that can dictate or impact a company's size. For those of you who do business with the federal government, you'll know that any set-aside contract has a NAICS code associated with it. Basically, it says what industry it's in. And then that NAICS code has an associated size standard, either in dollars or in number of employees. And in order to remain a quote-unquote small business that's eligible to compete for small business set-aside contract, you have to come in under that size threshold, whether it's dollars or numbers of employees. Well, if two companies are affiliated, what happens is the SBA smacks those two companies together, takes the total amount of revenue dollars or the total amount of employees across all of the affiliated companies, and that's what gets judged against the size standard. So not surprisingly, if you've got two companies that are affiliated with each other, that's going to mean their aggregate size is judged against the size standard. Affiliation has the potential to push some businesses over the size threshold rather, and change their status. So when you're talking about a joint venture, the general rule is that for purposes of the joint venture size, the size of the joint venture is going to be determined by aggregating the size of all the joint venture partners. In other words, if you have Company A and Company B and they form a joint venture, Company A's size plus Company B's size, employees or revenue, depending on the size standard, equals the JV's size. So if you've got two small businesses, there's an exception to that rule that says, hey, you don't have to aggregate the size of two small businesses if they form a joint venture. If you've got a joint venture that's formed of companies that are independently small, in other words, if each of the companies is small in and of itself, you don't have to worry about adding their size up. So if you're trying to form a joint venture between two small companies, you're pretty much good to go. You can just start the joint venture process because you fall under that exception. You don't have to worry about your aggregate size. But if you're trying to form a joint venture between a large and a small company, you don't fall under that exception. So you're under the general rule, meaning that the SBA is going to say the size of the JV is equal to your size plus your joint venture partner size. Obviously, if your joint venture partner, or if one of the joint venture partners is a large business, that's going to mean that you're over the size threshold. So how do you get around that? You form a mentor-protege pair first. The other exception to the joint venture rule is that if you are a member, or if the joint venture partners are a member of a mentor-protege approved relationship, either under the SBA's 8A program or the All Small program, then you do not have to worry about aggregating your size, and as long as you fulfill other obligations, which we're going to talk about as we go forward today, you can have a joint venture that is eligible to compete for small business set-aside contracts. Next slide, please. So you've determined that you need to form a mentor-protege pair first. There are two SBA mentor-protege programs. The first is the 8A program. That's been around for quite some time, but it's obviously, well, not obviously, I should say, but as the name would indicate, it is open only to 8A companies. So SDVOSB, women-owned, straight small companies, hub-zone companies, they are not eligible for participation and cannot get a mentor under the 8A program. For that reason, there was a lot of talk for a long time about, the fact that it would make sense to form another mentor-protege program for other types of small businesses. And after a lot of talk for a long time, Congress finally told SBA, yes, form I think the term that was thrown around back then was universal, a universal mentor-protege program. It took the SBA a couple years, but a couple years ago, they finally came out with what they called the All Small Mentor-Protege program, and that is open to all small businesses. So you can use either of these programs, depending on your eligibility, to form your mentor-protege pair. A lot of clients ask me about the agency mentor-protege programs. I know, many of the agencies had their own programs, but I will tell you, they're kind of being phased out just as a matter of preference. And also, they don't give you the benefits that we're going to talk about as we go forward, like the affiliation issue that I already covered and some of the other things we'll cover further on in this presentation. So from my perspective, the agency programs don't offer as many benefits, and also the government seems to kind of be phasing them out. They're of limited utility. So there's no barrier to you participating in them, but make sure you understand the distinction between an agency-specific program and the SBA mentor-protege programs, which give you the benefits that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So I alluded to this earlier, but I'm going to stress it again. Again, I told you this is something you're going to hear woven throughout this presentation. The SBA mentor-protege programs, from the SBA's point of view, are meant as mentoring programs to small businesses. The SBA is very specific about the purpose of the program. They want the protege to be deriving benefit. They don't want this just to be a vehicle for large businesses to get, in on a joint venture where they can get 50% of the profits, or, we'll talk about profit sharing later, but, a substantial portion of the profits on small business set-aside contracts. SBA has a vested interest in keeping set-aside dollars in small business pockets. So they are fine allowing mentoring and allowing the benefits that go along with mentoring. SBA is not so fine with the mentor protege program being used just as kind of a throwaway to get access to joint venturing and that affiliation exception that we talked about before. So when you're trying to work your way through this process, whenever you see something that seems a little onerous or seems like it doesn't make sense, or if you're trying to figure out how to answer a question on your application, keep this in mind. Keep it in mind in terms of, what is the SBA going to want to see from me? And I do not say that because I want you to, just tell the SBA what they want to hear. I say that because it goes back to the other concept I talked about in the very first slide, open and honest communications and making sure that all partners are aware of their obligations. It's something that you're going to want to keep in mind when submitting your mentor protege application and actually talking about, what each party is agreeing to with regard to the mentor protege relationship itself. Next slide, please. So fundamental questions to start the process. Are you or your partner eligible to be a mentor? And are you or your partner eligible to be a protege? Not every company is going to be eligible to be a mentor. The key, in my mind, you obviously have to demonstrate that you possess good character, that you're not on the debarred list, etc. But the key, in my mind, is outlined in the regs, and it's that the mentor has to prove that they can impart value to the protege firm. They have to show that they are able to give lessons, kind of teach them lessons learned, and go through practical experience examples, and kind of share with them their general business operations and government contracting knowledge. They have to be able to show that they're in financial good health, etc. And there's also some limitations in terms of how many how many proteges a mentor can have. Generally speaking, you're not going to be eligible to have more than one protege at a time. There's an exception to that where the SBA can, in very limited circumstances, I'll say I've never seen it actually happen, authorize a mentor to have more than one protege at a time if it can demonstrate that the additional mentor-protege relationship isn't going to adversely affect either of the proteges. In terms of the protege eligibility, again, it's going to be a question of, showing that you are registered to SAM, that you're in good standing, showing that you're seeking business development, etc. And you're going to have to do certain things like, self-certify that you qualify as small in your primary NAICS code, or if there's a secondary NAICS code that you're trying to grow in, you might be able to qualify there as well, depending on the circumstances. Again, eligibility based on if you already have mentor-protege relationships. A protege firm is generally only going to be allowed to have one mentor at a time. Again, very limited circumstances. Again, I've never seen it actually happen. SBA may approve a second mentor for a protege when they think there's not going to be competition or that's not going to conflict with the assistance that's set forth in the mentor-protege relationship. In addition, the SBA is at least allowed, it says they may, the regulations, the word is used, examine whether you actually have SCVOSB, HubZone, WOSB eligibility when they're doing their initial kind of intake and evaluation of the mentor-protege relationship. Next slide, please. So the application process that you are going to go through is you're going to go onto the website and you're going to submit a number of documents. The most important of those documents is the mentor-protege application and agreement. And again, when you're putting this together, you're going to want to remember that purpose. Remember that the SBA looks at this as being driven by the protege learning from the mentor. For those of you participating in the 8A program and the 8A mentor protege program, 8A companies have to have a business plan in place already. For those of you who are in the other small business programs and want to participate in the all small mentor protege program, it's going to be a little bit new to you to have to prepare a business plan. But the key to that business plan is to think about the ways in which you want to grow. What types of mentoring do you think would allow you to grow? And then you're going to want to link that up in what you actually submit to the SBA in terms of your application and agreement, showing how the mentor is going to help you grow in the areas you've outlined in your business plan. Again, it all comes back to showing the SBA that there's a mentoring relationship going on, showing that the mentor is going to continue to provide services to the protege, help that protege expand and grow and become a bigger and better, stronger business. The SBA is going to issue a written decision within 45 days of calendar days, of the mentor-protege relationship. Now, if you are denied, you do have the ability to request reconsideration, and once you will also have the ability to amend or revise your agreement and application, etc., as part of that process. If you are denied again, you're going to have to wait, or you're going to have to try with a different mentor or a different protege, as the case may be. But again, you're going to have some back and forth, or at least in my experience, there's usually some back and forth with the SBA if they have questions. And the application process has been, in my experience, moving very quickly, especially compared to how it used to move. Next slide, please. So the next step, now that you've got your mentor-protege set up, for those of you who are only setting it up so that you could form a joint venture, obviously the next step, you've got your approval in hand, and you want to form a joint venture with your mentor or your protege. There are, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, a number of things that you need to be aware of when you're forming that joint venture. As with any joint venture, whether it's a small business set-aside joint venture, whether it's a joint venture for mentor-protege teams or not, you need to think about all of the corporate considerations that you need to think about in terms of how you want to set up the joint venture, how it's going to be operated, how distributions and, dividends are paid, everything that would normally go into any formation of a company. But when you're talking about a joint venture in the small business context, and in particular when you're talking about a joint venture formed by a mentor-protege pair, you also have to think about making sure that joint venture agreement and any operating agreement that might be separate from the joint venture agreement itself are compliant with the small business regs. And those regulations are outlined at 13 CFR 125.8. I'm not going to go through each one of them, in detail, just because that would take an hour and also it would put you all to sleep. But I am going to go through kind of in summary and tell you the categories of things that you need to be aware of. And those categories include, most importantly, what needs to be in your joint venture agreement. If you've got a joint venture agreement that is between a mentor-protege pair, there are a list of 19 provisions that need to be in there. Again, it would absolutely put you to sleep to read them verbatim, and it would take an hour. But the keys are, you need to recognize that the joint venture is a separate legal entity, and the small business has to own at least 51% of that joint venture. So again, remember talking about, everyone being on the same page, everyone understanding what the obligations are and what compliance, how to comply with the rules, and making sure that that's not a deal breaker for anyone. That's something you might want to talk about up front. The ultimate joint venture you form has to be 51% owned by the small business. Make sure that the large business partner is aware of that. In addition, you've got requirements that the small business perform at least 40% of the work that the joint venture performs. That's a large portion. Sometimes large businesses aren't happy with that. More often, they're not happy with the fact that each participant receives profits from the joint venture commensurate with the work performed, meaning that in any joint venture formed with a mentor-protege pair that's going after small business set-aside contracts, the joint venture, the profits are going to go at least 40% to the small business entity. They own 51%, they get at least 40% of the profits. So these are the types of things, again, that if you don't understand and discuss up front, might be a problem down the road, because everyone might not be on board. There's also going to be a whole host of issues concerning who has control of the joint venture, because small businesses need to be controlled by joint ventures need to be controlled by small businesses, and small businesses need to be controlled by the requisite individuals, like the 8A individual or the woman or the service-disabled veteran, etc. You're also going to need to be very careful in your joint venture agreement about anything that gives the large joint venture partner too much control. Another thing that the joint venture partner needs to be aware of going in and make sure that this is not a deal breaker. In addition to these various provisions that need to go in your joint venture agreement itself, there are performance of work requirements, and I kind of stated those in regard to that 40%. But under 13 CFR 125.6, the joint venture, remember when you're talking about joint venturing, the joint venture itself is the prime contractor. So the joint venture itself is going to have to comply with 13 CFR 125.6. That is a regulation that states that a prime contractor on any set-aside job needs to self-perform certain percentages of the work. Now, depending on what type of contract you're talking about, it could be 15%, it could be 25%, it could be 50%. There are some limited exceptions if you subcontract to other types of small businesses. Those can get rather complicated, and we're not going to get into them today. But remember that the joint venture has to perform in accordance with those established percentages in 13 CFR 125.6. But in addition, whatever the joint venture does, the small business joint venture or the protege needs to perform 40% of. And it's also key to remember that that 40% can't be made up of what they call ministerial or administrative functions. They have to be getting substantive experience. In addition, the joint venture is going to have to certify that they are performing work in compliance with that performance of work percentage. They also are going to have to do a certificate of compliance saying that they've made sure that their joint venture agreement is compliant, that they've certified the percentage of work is compliant, etc. In addition, they're going to have certain provisions about inspection of records. You have to allow the SBA authorized representatives to inspect during normal business hours the JV's files, etc. So these are the things that you need to make sure you're aware of. Again, they're listed at 13 CFR 125.8, but I think it's important to consult a legal experienced legal practitioner, myself or one of my colleagues or peers out there, to make sure that you really understand what all those regulations are. And the reason why that's so important is that the consequences of non-compliance can be pretty serious. You can lose your small business status. You can have the mentor-protege agreement kind of revoked or nullified, or you can have you actually get suspended or debarred. So this isn't just a question of small business eligibility. This is a question of making sure that you can continue to do business with the federal government at all going forward. They are very serious consequences. Do not, as I've seen clients do, go online and find a template joint venture agreement, even if it says it's a template joint venture agreement that's consistent with the SBA regs. Online templates are not to be trusted, especially given that these regulations have changed in recent years. You really need to make sure that you know what the current regulations are and that your agreement is compliant with that. Next slide, please. All right, so let's say you get your mentor-protege formed, you get approval, you get your joint venture, you make sure you're compliant. You think you're good to go. And you are for the most part, but you aren't entirely out of the woods yet. You need to make sure that you are aware of certain ongoing reporting and monitoring issues. The SBA is going to check in on the mentor-protege relationship, and they're going to expect that the mentor is continuing to provide mentoring services, and they're going to expect a reporting and an accounting from the protege, both in terms of type of assistance and sometimes an accounting of hours. The protege receives this many hours of this type of mentoring support from the mentor, et cetera, et cetera. The SBA is not going to allow the mentor-protege relationship to continue if they do not feel that the protege is getting benefit, and they're not going to let the protege or the mentor-protege relationship continue if they feel as though it's being used as a vehicle only to joint venture and there's no actual mentoring processing going on. Also be aware about the limitations. You can't just use your joint venture indiscriminately over and over again for the rest of your mentor-protege relationship. There are limits on how many times you can joint venture without being found to be affiliated. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with those rules and make sure that you are compliant with those rules so that you're not being found affiliated with your joint venture partner. Those are pretty much the biggest pitfalls when you're talking about joint venturing. Again, failing and joint venturing under the mentor-protege program in particular, failing to comply with the ongoing reporting requirements, failing to actually have the mentor provide the mentoring services that were promised, and failing to familiarize yourself with the affiliation rules and make sure that you're not otherwise deeming yourself affiliated even though you went through the mentor-protege process. Next slide, please. So with that is going to wrap up our presentation on the mentor-protege process and joint ventures under the mentor-protege program. If you have questions, you can contact me here. I've got my phone number and my email up. And with that, I will turn it over to Mallory to wrap up.
Thank you, Maria, for sharing your knowledge and insight today. Today's presentation has been recorded and can be found on our website or YouTube channel within about 48 hours. If you have questions about today's topic, please contact Maria at the phone number or email shown on your screen. Thank you, everybody. This concludes the webinar.